If you have a Bible and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn in it to Luke, the 20th chapter. This is where we'll be spending our time. Everybody who is breathing likes to have nice things said about them. I mean, I don't think that's anybody's case that they would just say, well, I don't really care. I've heard people say that, but I don't really believe it. I think everybody kind of likes people to say nice things about them, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think we all need to be encouraged. But sometimes there can grow an expectation where people expect that things are going to be said about them. In other words, they're going to be recognized, they're going to be seen, and those things will be brought out in public ways that bring all sorts of attention to us. I can tell you this, speaking as one who is a parent, if you expect as a parent that your children are going to turn around to you frequently and say, boy, you really were a good parent, or we're really thankful that you provided food for us all of our lives, you're going to find yourself a little disappointed, I think, from time to time. But there is a place wherein if we have an expectation that people are going to recognize us for something, we're going to find that that desire and expectation can actually become destructive to our soul. Let's take a look at this text and see what it would say to us. I'll begin reading in verse 45 of chapter 20 in Luke. As all the people were listening, Jesus said to his disciples, beware of the experts in the law, that is, the scribes, the Herodians, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the rabbis. They like to walk around in long robes, and they love elaborate greetings in the marketplaces, the best seats in the synagogues, the places of honor at banquets. And yet they devour widows' property and make a show of a long prayer. They will receive a greater punishment. Now, this is, just imagine if, let's say for instance, some politicians were in here this morning, and I were to speak to the evils of politicians thinking that they're any more than just somebody who wears their pants or their skirt like everybody else does, and they happen to get elected to something, and now we're expecting them to perform tasks for us as our employees. And if they think anything differently, they're thinking wrongly. I could imagine that sometimes politicians start to think of themselves in certain ways, like they deserve a certain kind of honor when they show up in certain gatherings. Just imagine they were sitting here. Just imagine this crowd where Jesus is talking to these people about this. There are a lot of common folks like you and me, but the scribes, the Pharisees, the Herodians, the rabbis, the Sadducees, the intelligentsia are in this crowd. And Jesus says, beware of those people who like to wear long robes and be seen in public to be somebody. Wow. I mean, if I were one of those people, hot sweat would pop out on my face because I think he's talking about me. Well, in that culture, you have to realize there were two laws. There was the written law of Moses, 613 precepts of Moses, 603, and then the 10 Commandments. And in those 613 precepts, most Jews understood what those were. But there was another law. It was called the oral law. The only people who knew the oral law very well were the scribes, the Pharisees, the Herodians, the Sadducees, and the rabbis, because they had the freedom of time to study it and learn it. People like us who had to work for a living didn't have that time. And so they were surprised sometimes by some of the things the oral law held. But one thing the oral law held that they were not surprised about, and that was you were to honor a rabbi, a scribe, a Pharisee, a Sadducee, a Herodian, somebody in a long robe who came into a gathering, came into the marketplace, and they were seen to be these important people, and you were expected to honor them. As a matter of fact, you were expected to honor them in ways that were kind of official. If a rabbi or a Sadducee or a Pharisee were in the room, they were the preeminent person. They were just expected that you would honor them in that way. If you were at a big meal, a big gathering, the rabbi, the scribe, they would always be invited up to the front of the room at the best seat, and that's where they would be seated always. And everybody just understood that. That's the way it is. The oldest rabbi or the oldest Pharisee would always be honored. And if you greeted one of these folks in the street and you didn't conclude your greeting with "my master" to a teacher, you had dishonored them. They claimed preeminence over your parents. If you had to choose between the rabbi and your parents, you chose the rabbi. If you had to choose between the Pharisee and your parents, you chose the Pharisee. Esteem for a good friend was always to be lesser than the esteem for the Jewish intelligentsia, always. And everybody understood this. If you saw your parents struggling under a load of some kind, and you saw the teacher struggling under the load, you were to go relieve the teacher and leave your parents to struggle. And everybody thought that was just the way it is. It was understood. One of the things the rabbis would say, the teachers would say, would be this. This was a common Jewish saying. Your father brought you into the world, but I, the rabbi, will take you into the next one. Which one's more important? Obviously, the rabbi. I mean, he's going to take me into the next world. If a rabbi was in captivity, or a Sadducee, or a scribe, or one of the Sanhedrin, one of those wearing the long robes, and your parents were in captivity, you were to try to ransom the Jewish official first. Now, these kinds of things seem incredible to us today because we're part of a culture that says, I elected you, right? I'm the boss. I'm the public. I'm the one that pays your salary. So we view things very differently than they did at this time in history. And so when we think of somebody who expects honor, we think there's something wrong with them. I do. I can't speak for anybody else in this room, but if I got somebody who expects me to do certain things in their presence just because of who they are, I think there's something deficient about that person's character. But in this culture, that was not the case. I know pastors who think this way. I've talked to the people in their churches. They expect that they're to be obeyed. They expect that if they tell you the Bible says X, Y, and Z, that's what it says. And you're not to bother about trying to figure out for yourself what the Bible says. And you're certainly not supposed to ask a question that challenges what that pastor has told you. I've spoken to believers who are in churches like that. If you ever see me do anything like that, hand me over to John so that John can pour me a big, tall glass of getting whooped because something's wrong with me. I mean, honestly, there's something wrong with that kind of attitude about life. This is the beauty of the gospel. Is talk to people who have truly become followers of Jesus. And they, to a person, no matter who they are, no matter what their station in life, they will tell you, I'm just a follower of Jesus and nothing more. I've been saved by the blood he shed. My name's in his book, and that's about the best thing you can say about me. Anybody who's truly born again will always come to that point because the gospel levels the ground for everybody. There is nobody who's... That's why Jesus said, don't call anybody your father. He wasn't talking about our parents. He was talking about honoring somebody beyond the fact that they are just a fallen human being just like you and me. Now that doesn't mean, don't misunderstand, that we don't show respect. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if you go to England, when the Queen walks into the room, you better stand up. Now, I think there's something weird about that. But as a nice person, I will defer to that and look at her as somebody who's got a problem. That's how I respond to it, but I'm going to do her the favor of standing up. When I was raised as a child, I was taught that when a woman came into the room, or you're sitting at a table and a woman comes to the table, you stand up. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not what I'm talking about. That is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is when somebody has a view of themselves that makes them more than a fallen human being before a holy God. That's what I'm talking about. It was said during the time of Jesus, some of the rabbinical sayings were, whoever puts income into the purse of the wise is counted worthy of a seat in the heavenly academy. There you go. I mean, you want to be part of the heavenly academy? Put some money in the purse of the wise. Whoever harbors a disciple of the wise in their home is counting as if they had offered a daily sacrifice. Let one's house be a place of resort to the rabbis and the teachers. I mean, some of these things are not bad, but what happens is, and Jesus makes mention of this in this text, he says, you who devour widows' homes. He's talking about those who expect that and who also use their station in life to exploit other people, which was a common practice in the Jewish culture in which Jesus is speaking here. For instance, rabbis, I don't know if you were aware of this or not, rabbis were supposed to have a trade. If you were a Jewish rabbi, you were supposed to have a trade. You were supposed to derive your living elsewhere. It wasn't that you couldn't take offerings, it was that you were supposed to be doing something to supplement your income so that you weren't a burden to people, many of who couldn't afford to pay anything at all. And so some of these rabbis would take advantage of people like widows. If you were a widow in this culture, you were in trouble because a widow had no means of support at all. You remember the widow Nain, widow of Nain. Nain's a town in Judea. They're at a funeral, and she's walking behind the casket as they're carrying her son to be buried. And Jesus raises her son from the dead. Why was that such a big deal? Well, one of it is your son got raised from the dead, but the other is her son is her only means of support as a widow. In that culture, widows were just cast out. If your husband didn't leave you the inheritance, which was not the common practice, most of the time that went to the oldest son, then as a widow, you're just on your own. Lots of widows were like that. That's why you see in the New Testament church them taking up collections for the widows, because there were lots of widows who were abandoned by their families, not in a mean way, but that was just the way the culture was orchestrated. And so a widow would be with no means of support. There were some widows, Jewish widows, who would spend their time in the temple serving all the time. They would go to the temple and pray. And people gave to those widows, number one, because they had no other means, and also because they were so faithful in the temple. The Jews respected that. You remember when Jesus was born, there was a widow in the temple named Anna who was very aged, who everybody respected. That was one of those widows. But sometimes these rabbis would take advantage of the widow, and they would take their inheritance from them if they had one. Through legal means, they would use the machinery of the legal system to take their inheritance from them. And nobody thought anything about it because, after all, widows are just cast out anyhow. So there were these kinds of things going on. As my wife is wont to say, when we're watching some movie or something or a report about somebody who's been treated unjustly by somebody of high station, she'll say, there's probably going to be a really hot coal prepared for them, a really hot fire prepared for that one. I don't know about that, but I'll tell you, it raises up something in us to see somebody of wealth and position take advantage of somebody who has nothing. But that was very common in Jesus' day. So what about us? I mean, this text speaks to a lot of spheres of living for you and for me. The place where it speaks in our lives, to me, that's most important and most common for all of us is to say, what do we think of ourselves? Where do you and I locate our esteem as a human being? Some people locate it in what they do for a living. Some people locate it in how much land they've got or whether they possess things. Some people locate it in their reputation in the community. And Jesus is telling us not to locate it in any of those things. I mean, think of it for just a moment. What does it mean to you when you read in the Bible that you and I have been created in the image of God? That's esteem. You and I are the people that walk around this world and show the world what God is supposed to look like. 24/7. That's a big job. That's something that really means something. So if we're going to locate our esteem in something, why not locate it in something that really has meaning instead of locating it in something that's going to pass? I mean, when I was traveling with the band, the two different bands I traveled with, I got to tell you, I'm going to just be honest. When you're a guitar player, lead guitar player in a rock and roll band, after you get done playing, lots of college students and high school students and people want to come up and talk to you. They want to talk about your equipment, what kind of guitar, what do you practice, what kinds of things do you do to get where you are, how did you get to be so fast as a guitar player, that's a big deal. All those features, and I love that. I got to be honest, it was fun to me that people would come up. I can remember for years, and I never understood this, but it didn't mean I didn't participate in it. People would come up and they'd hand you a picture. They bought a picture of your band at the table back there for $1, and they brought it up and they want you to sign it under your picture. I thought, wow, isn't that cool? They want me to sign my picture. But if I locate my esteem in that, if somebody takes a picture of me now, they're probably not going to want me to sign that because I don't look like I looked when I was 26 years old, right? There's not anything standing here that says, I'd love to have a picture of him on my wall with his name underneath it. I don't think so. And if I'm locating my esteem in the fact that I was a really good guitarist and people recognized it, I don't do that anymore. I'm not there anymore. So if I'm finding my esteem, and I sure don't find my esteem in what I do for a living because I get dirty every day, so it's no big deal that I go out and get dirty every day at work. If I find my esteem in those things that I'm doing, they're going to pass. Where do you think somebody who winds up, their body fails them? Where's their esteem? Where's somebody who's burned in a fire and they don't look like the person that you knew or I knew? Where's their esteem? Jesus taught us something really important, and it's not just for people who preach or teach or anything like that. It's bigger than that. And I want to read that for you if I could. It's found in Matthew chapter 20. It's one of my life verses because of what he teaches. In Matthew chapter 20, verse 20, and if you don't have to turn there unless you want to, Jesus is in a place where the disciples are there, and James and John's mother is also there. And James and John's mother is married to Zebedee, so these are called the sons of Zebedee. That was James and John, had the fishing business. The mother of Zebedee comes to Jesus and kneels down in front of him and asks him for a favor for her two sons. Jesus says, well, what do you want? She says, permit these two sons of mine to sit at your right hand and your left when you come into your kingdom. Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking for. Are you able to drink the cup that I'm able to drink? They said, we are. These two boys, they stand up, throw their chest out and say, we are able to drink it. Jesus says, you will drink my cup. But to sit at my right hand and my left is not mine to give. It's for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father. Now when the other 10, imagine you're there and you're in earshot of the other guys. They're all following Jesus too. They've given up a lot to follow him. And they hear these two who are saying, we want to be top dogs in your kingdom. We would like to sit at your right hand and left on your throne. Give us littler thrones, but next to your throne. That's how we want to be seen. And they were angry, it says. The other 10 were indignant, is the word there, toward these two brothers. Jesus says, he points to all I bet you Jesus pointed at them when he said this. He says, that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over their subjects and those over whom they've been given authority. It must not be this way among you. Now think who he's talking to here. These guys are going to start the church. They're going to be the authority. He says to them then, whoever wants to be great should be your servant. Whoever wants to be first should be your slave, just as the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. I just want to think about that for just a minute. What would you pick it? What would church look like if that were the way that every pastor or Sunday school teacher or music leader, whoever they are, saw themselves that way? It's not to be that way with you. What would our political system look like if everybody who gets elected to an office looked at themselves as a servant instead of a boss? What would that look like? I'll tell you, those who anchor their esteem in becoming something will find themselves disappointed. And I believe this. I believe that God will take them down a few notches to make sure they remember. You remember Nebuchadnezzar? Nebuchadnezzar learned this lesson the hard way. He walked out on his platform one day on his balcony. He looked out across the land and he said, "Look at what I, the great king Nebuchadnezzar, have built." And within a few short hours, he found himself crazy and in a field covered with the dew, sleeping outside in all of his fancy robes, rolling in the mud and eating grass like an animal. And God left him there for a while, until one day he woke up and he said, "You're Lord, I'm not." And God restored his kingdom. Jesus issues this warning, and I'll tell you, it is a sobering warning. Those who think themselves worthy will receive a severe punishment. James says, if any of you thinks you should teach, you better rethink that, because you're going to be judged more harshly. Man. Obedience will produce fruit. It will. But it's not the kind of fruit that you and I might think it will be. Let me just close with this. Think about this. I love this passage. I had it read to me once in a very critical moment of my life. Good old Peter says this: "You have purified your soul by obeying the truth in order to show sincere love to others. So love one another earnestly from a pure heart. You have purified your soul by your obedience." Wow. Just think what that means. That means the ground around the cross is level. Nobody's lifted up. We're all under one head, and that's Jesus. And if we'll obey him, it will purify our souls as we go through our life. Wow. What a gift. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me,